Now, the city of Buffalo has lost a longtime spiritual and community leader this noon. The Reverend Bennett Smith has died. News 4 senior correspondent Rich Newberg has been talking to those who knew the man and his impact on this community.
Yeah, we'll get you.
The Reverend Bennett Smith was one of Buffalo's great civil rights leaders who marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 60s and carried the dream of equality and justice through the decades.
Dr. King was a leader for all people. He did not see this country in terms of race, but he saw this country as one people.
Reverend Smith spearheaded many community projects, taking his spiritual commitment for social change into the secular world. Here he receives close to $1 million from the federal government for a family life center in Buffalo.
Prime example of the federal government giving those who are the least, the lost, and the left out a hand up.
Buffalo's NAACP president Frank Messiah remembers Reverend Smith as a man of action.
The interesting thing is how he could take passages from the Bible and relate those passages, which are, ancient, but to make them seem as if they were part of the day-by-day living of people today.
Sometimes Reverend Smith would be at odds with City Hall, for example, when Marilyn Smith was ousted as city treasurer. But Reverend Smith was always looked upon as a leader and a guiding light.
He was a visionary. He understood the importance of faith-based initiatives long before anybody ever talked about it.
Reverend Smith was the pastor of St. John Baptist Church for 29 years. He passed away last night after a long illness. He was 68 years old. Funeral arrangements are now being made by the family.
He was so well known, of course, to us here, but far beyond Buffalo, he was well known.
Yes, he was, Jackie. He was a member of the World Council of Churches, past president of the National Baptist Convention, which has 4 million members. A lot of memories. I covered him for 23 years here in Buffalo. We'll have much more coming up at 5 and 6.
I always think of him there in the pulpit of St.
Great
John
orator.
Baptist Church.
That voice carried for blocks and blocks when he spoke.
I know a lot of reaction is coming in, and you'll have more for us. Thanks, Rich.
He marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights Movement, and he opened his own community center right here in Buffalo.
Tonight, the Queen City mourns the loss of the Reverend Bennett Smith. Senior correspondent Rich Newberg looks at the Reverend's lifelong dedication to making Buffalo a better place to live.
You have been the greatest president for our people of all time.
Reverend Bennett Smith was a powerhouse at the pulpit and a political force out of Buffalo that presidents and politicians from all levels of government sought out as an ally.
If you mention Reverend Bennett Smith, people knew that you were talking about Buffalo, New York, and where he was from.
Reverend Smith's commitment to social change dates back to his time with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the dream of equality, a dream he pursued even after Dr. King's assassination.
I think that it was unfortunate that we lost this great man. This country never got a chance to see the good that could have come had he but lived.
During his 68 years of life, Reverend Smith was able to see the fruits of his labor, here receiving $1 million check from Congressman Jack Quinn towards his family life center.
We have to get these children off the street and give them a safe haven.
The center is scheduled to open next month. His church, St. John the Baptist, also built low-income housing and housing for the elderly.
He was a visionary. He understood the importance of faith-based initiatives long before anybody ever talked about it.
His gift was his ability to reach people through the spiritual message, to move them into action, to somehow make their world a better place.
He had a way of putting things together where we could understand it in a practical way as well as a spiritual way.
The more we get together, how happy we'll be.
Funeral arrangements still have not been finalized. Reverend Smith was with St. John Baptist Church for 29 years. He passed away last night after a long illness, and he will be missed.
Yeah, he was the voice of a community. In fact, whenever there was a crisis, we would always go to him.
That's the key word. He was one of the first we went to for a sense of direction. When the .22 caliber killer was on the loose, Reverend Smith's voice was the voice of reason. I'll have much more coming up at 6.
Very good. Thanks, Rich.
Thanks, Rich.
A longtime spiritual and community leader in Buffalo has died. The Reverend Bennett Smith leaves a lasting legacy.
Tonight, News 4 senior correspondent Rich Newberg reports on the impact he had on this community and talks with those who were touched by him.
Let's give him a hand.
Reverend Bennett Smith was a visionary to many who had the ability to turn his visions into reality.
Keep you going, Reverend Smith, with almost $1 million.
Thank you. Let's give him a hand.
Here he received $1 million towards his Family Life Center in Buffalo, which is scheduled to open next month.
We have to get these children off the street and give them a safe haven.
Through his St. John Baptist Church, he built housing for low-income families and for the elderly. He had marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and never gave up on his dream for equality.
He was very wise, very bright, and certainly somebody who saw the big picture, and that's going to be difficult to replace.
Reverend Smith was a political force, recognized and honored by politicians locally and nationally. He gave a strong vote of confidence to President Clinton when the president was having some major problems.
You have been the greatest president for our people of all time.
Sometimes there were conflicts he could not resolve, like when his wife lost her job as city treasurer because of checks that were not deposited in a timely manner.
I call upon the mayor to apologize.
And when his friend, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, had a child with a woman in an extramarital affair.
This does not have to be the end, that this can be a healing experience.
But what he could change, he did, always looking for a better way for his people.
He's really going to be missed in this community.
The more we get together, how happy we'll be.
The family hopes to have funeral plans finalized tomorrow.
How many years was he at St. John Baptist?
29 years he gave of his life.
Wow.
And he traveled all over the world in the name of peace and justice, really trying to make the world just a little bit better. But he did a lot of great things.
Had he been
at
ill
home.
for a while?
People knew he was sick, yeah. It was quite a decline in the last few weeks. Wasn't a shock, people were expecting it, but tough shoes to fill.
It's a loss for this community.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Buffalo is paying tribute tonight to a man of faith who marched with Dr. Martin Luther King and kept the dream of equality alive for generations to come here in Buffalo. Senior correspondent Rich Newberg reports tonight on the legacy of the late Reverend Bennett Smith.
They are coming in from all over the city, the country, and the world to pay homage to the late Reverend Bennett Smith.
He was a great servant, a servant of the Lord and a servant of the people, and he made a great contribution. I mean, just look at this neighborhood, the housing that he built.
Housing for low-income families, housing for the elderly, and a soon-to-be-completed multi-purpose family center that will house a school, walk-in clinics, and recreation center, all within walking distance of the church.
This corner of this church is a little bit of heaven right here on earth.
He was a man of action whose faith guided his decisions.
When he chose to move and to act, and a vision to unfold that the Lord had given him, that he didn't have to take a poll. He didn't have to check with anyone to find out what they think.
Old partners in the struggle for civil rights, including the Reverend Jesse Jackson, will be here for the funeral. The Reverend Otis Moss, who had introduced Reverend Smith to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., says Bennett Smith will go down in history as one of the greats of our time.
He was a change agent. He was a prophet of social justice and social transformation.
He was a man who did more than just preach the word, said one mourner. He lived the word. Rich Newberg, News 4 at 6.
And Governor Pataki and Senator Hillary Clinton are among those who will be attending tomorrow's funeral.
Now, live from Channel 4 in Buffalo, this is News 4 at noon.
Saying goodbye to a local spiritual and community leader. Good afternoon. Our big story this noon, family and friends from around the world are gathering at St. John Baptist Church in Buffalo to say farewell to Reverend Bennett Smith. The local civil rights and church leader died last week after a battle with cancer. News 4's Rich Newberg begins our team coverage outside the church where services are about to begin. Rich?
Jackie, he was a pastor to a congregation of 3,500, but he touched so many lives, from those of politicians to people in the street looking for hope. Reverend Bennett Smith's widow, Marilyn, greeted mourners as they paid their last respects to her husband before the service began. The Reverend Jesse Jackson, a longtime friend of Reverend Smith, recalled their time together fighting for social justice around the world and right here in Buffalo.
I came here one time with him when there was a riot in Buffalo. We came back here that night and worked the TV stations and worked the churches to stop the riot. We were here together fighting for nurses who were on the nurses' strike. We did voter registration drives here. In many ways, BW brought to Buffalo a national stature.
Reverend Otis Moss, who will deliver the eulogy, called Reverend Smith a prophet of social justice who never gave up on the dream of equality.
There was not a bone in him that would say, you ought to quit, you ought to leave, it's too difficult, it's not going to happen, it's not worth it. He continued to move, and when
he moved around the world, fighting for equality in South Africa, while building a better world for his people in Buffalo. He had come from humble beginnings.
I was always amazed at when we traveled in the United Kingdom, South Africa, Cuba, Argentina, how he was able, as a barefoot boy from Alabama, to be able to sit with kings and queens and presidents.
He was guided by the Spirit of the Lord, says his widow, and always found the right words, words that turned into action and led others to action.
I think that he expected from us that had social responsibilities to follow his example and just not talk the talk, but walk the walk.
He got to see his family life center take shape, a center for education, health care, and recreation. He loved children and seniors and families and wanted to help those with the greatest needs.
And the many, many lives you've touched will go on for generations and generations and generations.
When he was head of the Progressive National Baptist Convention, I think there are 4 million members in that convention, he brought in churches from all over the world, and representatives from those churches are here today. Reporting live, Rich Newberg, News 4 at noon.
Well, thank you, Rich. And Reverend Smith was known throughout Buffalo and many corners of this country for his leadership and willingness to help others. We continue our team coverage now with News 4's Lorey Schultz live at the church with that story. Lorey?
Well, Jackie, this very corner where I stand is very special to hundreds and hundreds of people who may not have known the Reverend personally, but they sure are grateful for his influence. They call it a little corner of heaven in Buffalo and ask those who live in the shadows of the St. John Baptist Church, and here's what they'll say.
Well, it is a corner of heaven because Reverend Smith organized and built it. It's a corner of heaven.
The late Reverend Bennett Smith Sr., longtime pastor of the church, leaves behind a rich legacy in this community. He used his church as a base for developing housing in his neighborhood. Bonnie Williams was among the first to move in to the St. John Tower Senior Citizen Complex when it opened back in '82.
I just love it here. It's just it's a nice place to live, and it's beautiful. We try to keep it nice for people to come in and live.
Within walking distance of the church, Smith also developed the McCarley Gardens. Today, young people who didn't even know the pastor personally appreciate his influence.
I lived on Delavan between Stevens and Shuey, and I just moved over here in April, and I like it. It's wonderful, beautiful.
All over the city, tangible evidence marks Smith's legacy, from a statue of Martin Luther King Jr. to an essential pedestrian bridge over the Kensington.
Before they had this bridge, you had a significant amount of people getting hit by that, cars. But now, since we have the bridge, it's easy access for, us to gain to get to the fruit belt.
I can't express how nice he was and what a powerful man he was.
Powerful indeed. The Reverend's latest venture, as Rich sort of touched on, was his multi-purpose family life center, which Jackie is scheduled to open very soon.
Oh, he was alive to see the groundbreaking there. Is the service underway now, Lorey?
It's just about to get underway, Jackie. Lots of people, as you can see, some are still filing in. A very crowded corner this noon.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, Lorey.
Topping the news, family, friends, and dignitaries say farewell to Buffalo civil rights and community leader, the Reverend Bennett Smith.
Funeral services for Reverend Smith were held at his church, St. John Baptist, here in Buffalo. Senior correspondent Rich Newberg is live at the church now with more. Rich?
There were no empty seats in the church, no empty hearts. You could feel his presence everywhere because Reverend Smith was that powerful a man. There was praise for the life of the Reverend Dr. Bennett Walker Smith. praised by his church family at St. John Baptist and the leaders he inspired in Buffalo, in the nation, and throughout the world.
We all have an obligation to follow his leadership when it comes to putting our faith in action.
His crowning achievement in Buffalo is the soon-to-open Family Life Center, built to meet the needs of children and seniors and everyone in between. It took all the strength he had to give.
Reverend Smith consistently demonstrated strength of commitment, character, and conviction.
He had marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and sometimes with the Reverend Jesse Jackson, met crisis after crisis head on, even here in Buffalo.
I came here one time with him when there was a riot in Buffalo. We came back here that night and worked the TV stations and worked the churches to stop the riot.
He would take leaders to task if he thought they needed a talking to, even if they didn't want to hear it.
He'd sit down, sometimes he would do it publicly, but he'd bring you upstairs in the upper room. Brother Pitts, I want you to come up to the upper room. I said, okay, Dr. Smith, I'm coming. What time do you want me? Oh, right now.
A guiding hand, a voice of reason, a man of action. Reverend Bennett Smith was remembered in so many different ways, leaving the world a better place because of all he did.
Well done, thy good and faithful servant.
Governor Pataki promised to commit resources to the Family Life Center, and speaker after speaker said we all have to live up to his example. Reporting live, Rich Newberg, News 4 at 5.
This is News 4 at 6.
A powerful legacy of faith in action. Good evening, everyone. Carol is off. Our big story tonight, though, is a stirring final tribute to a man who lived for the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King. The Reverend Dr. Bennett Smith was laid to rest today after a funeral service at his church, St. John Baptist, where senior correspondent Rich Newberg is standing by live. Rich?
The tributes went on and on, Don, a 4-hour farewell for the life and deeds of the Reverend Bennett Smith. They came from the highest levels of government, from the very foundation of the civil rights movement, and from all walks of life in our city to honor a man who had walked with them and served as their guide.
He was a man who believed in teaching.
Yes, sir.
He lived what he believed.
Yes, sir.
And he truly walked by faith.
Over and over again, he was remembered and praised as a man who put words into action, action guided by faith.
This was a family that was built on the Rock of Ages, that had a leader who understood that faith was not just in word, but in deed.
Reverend Bennett Walker Smith marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and confronted many a crisis with the Reverend Jesse Jackson by his side.
I think of him as the lion-hearted, tough mind, but tender heart. And wherever BW went, he made a difference.
He almost lived to see the opening of his Family Life Center in Buffalo, a center for education, health, recreation, and counseling.
And he's made on this corner a little bit of heaven here on earth.
You will have our help. That project will be the right thing. It will be completed in the name of Reverend Smith.
But it was in the faces of those he touched, young and old, that you sensed his legacy will live on.
So many people have benefited from Reverend Smith's numerous acts of kindness and his strong belief in the power of love.
He traveled all over the world for human rights and gave his all to make life here in Buffalo just a little bit better. Reporting live, Rich Newberg, News 4 at 6.
The Bennett Smith legacy looms large over Buffalo's inner city, where he spent a lifetime building better lives for the many people he served as a pastor, friend, and visionary. News 4's Lorey Schultz is live with the living testament to one man's faith in action. Lorey?
Well, Don, it's one thing to talk about someone's accomplishments. It's a whole nother thing to see them and actually meet the people who are benefiting from those services. She calls it a little corner of heaven in Buffalo. And from her apartment in the shadow of St. John Baptist Church, Shirley Grisham says she owes her thanks to the late Reverend Dr. Bennett Smith, who provided her with a safe place to live.
It's very important to me. I figure like this, when you're a senior, you need all the protection you can get. Because with my other house, it was kind of scary because I was by myself.
At a time before the term faith-based initiative was coined, the Reverend Smith backed up his deep spiritual strength with performance. He started with a church and then used its base to develop affordable housing in the neighborhood. Today, seniors feel secure at St. John Tower, and young families who reside at McCarley Gardens like what the pastor did for them.
Oh, I love walking around, have no problem at all. In the other neighborhood, you had to be careful, watch your back, and all that other stuff.
He was definitely a man of action. His latest venture, this multi-purpose family life center, which is soon to be open. It, too, is located right behind the church and will house a school, walk-in clinics, and a recreation center. Home health care aide Sylvia Strozier says the pastor will be sorely missed.
I think he did a great job. He's a great person, as far as I know of.
Politically astute and politically connected, Reverend Smith leaves behind a rich legacy. He lobbied for significant statues. Carrie Eldridge, who didn't know the pastor personally, says he also helped build bridges.
Before they had this bridge, you had a significant amount of people getting hit by that, cars. But now, since we have the bridge, it's easy access for, us to gain to get to the fruit belt.
What a difference the Reverend made in the lives of many in this community, leaving a lasting legacy for generations to come. Well, tonight all is quiet outside the church. The Reverend died of cancer, something the family addressed in the program as a gesture of hope to those of you who suffer. And one quote summed up, "Our greatest enemy is not disease, but despair." Live in Buffalo, Lorey Schultz, News 4 at 6.